Welcome to another exciting edition of Spector Creative, where we talk about hieroglyphics, cats, and toys, and mostly toys, and that's probably why you're here today. And this is the third in a series of videos I'm doing on big-ticket pre-sale items. And by big-ticket pre-sale items, I mean things like this. Mattel launched Mattel Creations after the defunct Matty Collector went away, and they offered large playsets, large items that wouldn't really work at retail due to lack of space and general interest. HasLab is Hasbro's version of this, and even some of the smaller companies like Super 7 have got into this method. But it's all about pre-selling the item because you're replacing the retailer in the buying process with now directly the collector. But they're taking that same spot to guarantee that there is a purchase order to go into production on large items like the sail barge. And one of the bigger issues fans have is the price of these big items. Like, whoa, I can't believe it's $500, $300, $10,000. And there's this illusion that toy companies are just raking in all this money from these big ticket items. And I can assure you that is so far from the truth. In fact, it's literally the opposite of that. Everything about thinking companies are making all this money and ripping off collectors, taking advantage of them, not true. These items, for the companies as a benefit, are PR drivers. Because they get collectors excited, collectors will put all this stuff on the internet and make a lot of noise. It's free promotion for the brand, for the company. That's one advantage. But two, they do make money, but they make the standard amount of money, the exact same amount that they would make with any item, and that's because of margin requirements. Now, what is a margin requirement? I've gone on for this a few times, but lacking doing a whole video about, Business 101. There's plenty of that on YouTube. Margin is essentially the difference between what a company sells an item to and what it costs them to make it. In other words, they're making it from a vendor in China, and then they're selling it to a retailer at a wholesale price. The difference between that is the margin, and that is set by the owners of the company, or the accounting team. Now, there's a difference between margin and profit. Margin is that difference. Profit is the money you have left over after you've paid for the product and you've paid for things like overhead. Everything from rental of buildings to salaries to healthcare, staplers, all that stuff. So yes, companies want to make a profit. That is obviously part of their plan. But the bigger companies, the bigger they are, the more overhead they have. And when they are producing items, like in China at a toy factory, they're going to work with them to get a price point so that they can sell them to their customer. Toy companies, their customers, Walmart and Target, remember, not kids. They're selling at wholesale to these retailers. The retailer customer is the child or parent, the one walking down the aisle. It's a common misconception. Everyone always thinks, oh, a toy company makes things for kids. Well, eventually they wind up in the hands of kids, but what they're really doing is building programs for retailers. Now, before anything ships out, before it's even thought about putting it on a boat and trekking it across the ocean or even going into production, not only do you have to have that PO in hand, which I made a previous video about how collectors can replace retailers in that model, but as I said, every item that company produces and ships has to hit the margin requirement. So if you have a smaller toy company that doesn't have huge overhead, like McFarlane Toys, well, they don't have to pay as many, bills. They don't have to pay stock dividends, so they can put more into the product, more deco, more articulation, that kind of thing. So when you have a very large item, like things offered by Mattel Creations, by HasLab, and they feel like, oh, this is coming, I can't believe how much they're charging for this. Well, they're making the same exact margin off of that they're making off of selling items at retail. The difference is, and it all comes down to three things. I've talked about these. One is the quota of the item, how that quota relates to the minimum order quantity, the minimum they can order. And then, of course, the third factor is retroblasting and their giant box of wooden blocks.
Recognize me, Scott.
All right, in all seriousness, so the margin requirement, let's just call it 50% for sake of a number that's easy to manage. A retail line is going to make that margin whole off of all the items. Some of the items are what are known as margin drivers. They might bring in 70%. Others might eat into the margin. They may only bring in 30%. But altogether, they'll hit that margin of 50%. With a single big ticket item, that one item has to deliver the margin. It doesn't have others to fall back on. And again, what I mean by falling back on, a really easy way to understand this, is to look at an assortment of action figures. And sometimes you'll see in that assortment there might be one figure that gets more deco or is physically bigger, comes with more accessories. Well, you will make up the margin you lose with a figure like this by having a smaller figure in that same assortment. The classic example is Malbolgia from the second or third Spawn wave from the 90s. This figure was huge, but it was made up for by the fact that other figures in the assortment didn't have as much deco. All right, so going back to that model, it's the same thing. When you have a giant item that's offered online, that one item has to hit the same margin that holistically a retail line has. And again, the retail line can spread that over several items where one item's making more than the margin, one item's making less, but altogether they make the margin. Now, of course, you have to hit the MOQ. That's the minimum order quota, and that's usually tier 1 of most of these online sales. But you can, of course, produce more than the MOQ, and that's when a company can really start making money. Because if they can make, 100,000 units, 200,000 units, 500,000 units, well, that comes down to the difference between tiered pricing and volume pricing. Tiered pricing you're probably familiar with when you're buying like a plan, and there's different versions you can buy, premium, gold, silver, bronze, tungsten. A volume sale discount is when the more you buy, the less per unit. And this is how it works in toy making and most manufacturing with Fortune 500 companies. Essentially, as your quota increases, your price per unit from the vendor, from the factory, goes down, and you can pass those savings off then to your customer. So you can say, hey, Mr. Target, Mr. Walmart, Mr. Toys R Us, Mr. Puzzle, Zoo, if you buy X number of units, you're going to get per unit a savings, whether it's a % off or a direct price per unit reduction. So because the Walmarts, the Targets, the Myers of the world have these huge aisles and huge number of doors, that's the number of locations. I mean, Walgreens has over, I think, like 8,000 locations in the US alone. They have huge buying power. And by producing a lot of the same item, huge numbers, well beyond the MOQ, and yes, no, this is real. Those aren't real stormtroopers. Those are toy stormtroopers. Trust me, I was there. That was the Great Wall of China. All right. So by producing, retail lines in bulk like this, they're going to make their margin through volume. They're not going to make it through one item, one 99-cent car. But a big ticket online item like Eternia, this is going to hit the margin on price. Because the quota is so low and maybe just at the MOQ or even below it, well, the cost is going to be high, so they have to charge the amount that lets them hit that same margin requirement they have for online. But they're barely hitting the MOQ. That's usually, again, what tier 1 is on these items, is the bare minimum they can produce. So they don't have the advantage of doing it by volume. They have to put everything into one SKU, and that's why it costs more, because they're making so few of them. If if retail took these items and they can make hundreds of thousands, it would be less, like comparing Eternia to Castle Grayskull. So in an ideal world, yeah, everything sells at a high quota. But because of the PR opportunity with collectors, with doing big ticket items, it's worth it. While Target may have thousands and thousands of locations around the country, they're still not going to be interested in taking an item that's going to have very limited appeal. And yes, I know we all think that collectors are huge and that we run the universe, and while we do, from a standpoint of how many of us are there, it's a little less. But the nice thing is collectors can all come together. All factions can support these online items. We may be a drop in the bucket from a number standpoint, but if we're willing to pay a slightly higher price, it's not gouging, it's hitting the price that's going to drive that required margin. And it's no different for any item in the company. They're not making way more money on, Ghost Rider's car here than they are on a, princess doll. It's the exact same margin. They just sell a heck lot more princess dolls, but they only have one Ghost Rider car to sell. All right, I hope this clarified one of the other sort of misconceptions of these pre-sales and how they financially work for companies and collectors. If you have more questions or need a follow-up video, let me know in the comments below, because I love clarifying this stuff. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.